Well, hello there, students at William Carey University, both in worship leadership and worship technology. Here again, because of the wonderful COVID-19, is our worship colloquium in kind of a digital online format. But through that avenue, it's enabled us to kind of bring in some other voices that we might not would have heard from otherwise. And today on this edition, I'm honored to be joined by a great old friend in the industry from Integrity Music that I'm grateful that you get to kind of meet here. A good friend of mine, Chuck Harris. Thank you, Chuck, for being with us today.
Great to be here, Lou. Thank you.
Yeah, well, Chuck, you can maybe give a little more light to this, but Chuck has been a long time marvelous, both front of house and studio engineer, and has mixed an immense amount of records, as guys my age probably still call them, projects that people all across the world literally have heard and embraced and have loved. So maybe just take a couple of minutes there, Chuck, and just a little perspective for my students of kind of what your background has been and maybe who you've had the honor of working with.
Yeah, absolutely. I started young. High school was kind of my first foray into recording or write songs and do that sort of thing. And knew that I wanted to be in the music business. I started as an artist, writing songs, playing guitar, went on tour with a band, did all that stuff. Our band went into the studio and did some recording, and that's really where I discovered the idea that I could record something and make it sound like a record. And so that kind of got under my skin. And I got into working for a guy. Actually, I was in a band. We got hired to do some radio jingles. And we were doing this little Mexican restaurant, and this friend of mine had written this jingle. And we went into this studio, and that was the first time I got to meet a guy named David Denny. And David was the other guitar player in the Steve Miller Band. And
Wow.
And so I would kind of like fall in love with a girl and then get my heart broken and then write a sad song about it and then save up $300 and go in and record a song at David's studio. That was my pattern. And one day David just said, hey, he needed some help and wondered if I would be interested. And so I did a 6-month internship with David in his studio. And that really was the very start of getting into professional recording and that. Along the way, I also did church sound for my church out in California, where I was living at the time, and did that for a number of years. And eventually got to working in a studio in the Bay Area, San Francisco Bay Area, called Master Track. And I had worked there for about 5 years, and I was doing both mastering and working in the studio, doing tracking sessions in the studio, and then bringing bands that I was involved with in at night and doing records and that kind of stuff. And one day we did these sessions, and it wasn't me. I had a friend who worked in the studio. He was the guy that hired me there, and his name, you'll know this guy, is Ron Davis.
Wow.
And yeah, and Ron, so Ron and I became good friends because I met him, and I kind of wanted to become a recording engineer, so I kept bugging Ron. I'd take him out to lunch and ask him a bunch of questions and stuff. And I had finished working with David, and I was looking for the next opportunity. And I finally bugged Ron enough where he talked to his boss, and they hired me on at the studio there. So about 5 years later, this guy comes in, and they're doing this record, and it's this record in Russian, and they found a Russian choir in San Francisco. They want to come in, and it turned out to be an Integrity record. And the producer was a guy named Don Moen. And that's how Don and Ron met, was doing that session. Ron was doing the session, and I just dropped into the session one day and said, hi, I met Don. I didn't know who he was or anything like that. And so then, long story short, Don ended up kind of recruiting Ron to come out to Alabama and build a recording studio for Integrity Music. And that's what happened. And Ron had been out there, and Ron kept calling me like every 6 months or so, and he'd say, "Hey, Chuck, well, how you doing? What's going on in life? You want to move to Alabama?" You know, and I'm living in San Francisco and, you know, working my dream jobs and all that. I'm thinking, no, I really don't want to move to Alabama. Um, but you know, life changes and circumstances change. And he called me back one day, and I said, you know what, Ron, I'd be willing to consider it. So I went through the interview process. And that's how I got to work at Integrity Music, and I was there for 11, 12 years. At one point, kind of managing the studios, other points being kind of like the main engineer, and all of that. So yeah, you're right. Got to mix a lot of records, worked on all the kind of the great Hosanna. I came in '94, and so whatever you're probably as familiar as I am with what was going on, but you know, we had a lot of Ron Canoli, Don Moen, of course, Paul Balash, Paul Wilbur, Robin Mark, gosh, you know, all of that stuff. Linda Shazo, John
Probably some
Chisholm.
Lincoln Brewster, probably.
Lincoln Brewster came along. Yeah, Lincoln came along a few years later, and that was fun. Got to work on his records. And so, yeah, left Integrity in 2005. And the Lord kind of put this opportunity in my lap of, I got a call from California, church in California, and they were starting a new position, a pastoral position, of running their media tech department. And this friend of mine that worked in the church, he called me and said, "Hey, would you be interested in this position?" And I thought, well, that's interesting. I don't know. I loved working in Integrity. I loved the atmosphere. I loved the people I was working with. I was, you know, doing all kinds of stuff. And I had to really think about it. So we went through a long process of making that decision. Talked to our pastors. I talked to Mike Coleman, the president of Integrity. Talked to Don Moen. I talked to a lot of people, and it just seemed like the Lord was opening a door for us there. And it was interesting to think about going into ministry, and instead of just being in the business. And I thought, okay, maybe this is how I'm supposed to spend, you know, the last half of my life and all of that. So we ended up accepting that, and moved out to California, back to the area where we had lived previously, and took a job at that church. And that turned out to be a really challenging experience. And I won't go into details about it, but you know, every culture is a little different, and it was a hard adjustment for us. And there were other things going on in our lives too. My dad, who lived in the area, he got sick and ended up passing away, and all of that. But long story short, we stayed in that area for 3 years and then moved back to Alabama. I started working for Don, who had left Integrity, and I was working for his company, and we were touring and producing projects and doing those kinds of things. Don was going to move to Nashville, and so I was going to move to Nashville, and an opportunity for us came up here in the Chattanooga area where we are now. And we took that opportunity to live here and commute to work with Don, do his radio program and do various things for him. So that was good. And how I got into the touring thing is another funny story. Don, one day, he was about 3 weeks from leaving on tour. He's going to Latin America, and he worked with another live sound engineer at the time who was doing all of his tours and stuff. And all of a sudden, 3 weeks before this tour, something fell through and his sound engineer couldn't do it. So Don walked over to the studio building at Integrity, and he came in and he said, "Hey, Chucky, you wanna go to Guatemala with me?" And I knew he was asking me to run sound for him. And I said, "No." And he said, "Well, I'm a vice president, so you're going anyway." That's what he said. And if you know Don, you know he was kidding.
Sure.
But it was a good moment, and I ended up going. It was, you know, I loved it, and that was the start of me working with Don. And it turned out that he rarely goes anywhere without me anymore, and we've been all over the world for about 22, 23 years now. So
Wow. Well, that leads into a question that I've had, and you've been to a lot of different scenarios, and more specifically, talking about the abroad thing. To any of my students who might have the opportunity to kind of travel abroad and run audio or lights or whatever thing, from a technology standpoint, um, my guess is things don't always go the way you would want it to from a technology standpoint once you get somewhere else outside of the US. So you want to speak to that a few minutes?
I could write a book, and yeah, we've had so many interesting experiences, and I think that the ultimate scariest ones are when you arrive at a venue. See, I go through a long process in preparation for doing a tour. We have a technical writer that we've written that outlines all of our expectations, from the PA and the lighting and the design down to stage plots and instruments and specific things that we hope to happen. Now, we realize we're going a lot of times into third world countries.
Sure.
You have to be flexible, but I always try to send the technical writer as a precursor to opening a dialogue with folks. And so what you hope is that you send something out, and I say it in the cover email. I'll say, I know it might not be possible to do everything here, but feel free to get back with me with questions and things that you need, and we can discuss swapping things out or doing things differently. And I'm sure it'll be fine. I just want to know,
Sure.
I just want to know what's going to happen. And the scariest ones are the ones where they just don't reply, or they'll send back an email and say, oh yeah, we got it covered, no problem. And so you kind of go thinking, all right, and I'll usually probe. I'll say, okay, so what piano is Don going to play? What keyboard is Don going to play? Anything, and they're like, oh yeah, we got it covered. So the scariest ones are when you show up and there is nothing on the stage.
Oh,
and
boy.
and the worst one was this church that we did in Asia, and we were going to do a workshop, a seminar, a worship seminar, and then the next night we were going to do a concert. So the understanding was that the church would provide, we'd just use whatever the church had for the seminar, because we didn't want them to have to rent a bunch of gear and all of that stuff. We would make it work with what they had, because it would be more realistic and it would be a better seminar that way. And I tried to communicate that really clearly, but somehow somebody in their mind got the notion that no, they were going to bring all this stuff in and set it up, and they thought it had been arranged. So honestly, they cleared everything off the stage. There wasn't a cable, a monitor speaker, a drum set, nothing in sight anywhere, an instrument, an amp. They had even gone as far as taking the mixing board off of the thing and unplug it in a closet, the front of house mixer. And I just walked in, and we're 2 hours from starting the seminar. And I just walked in. I was like, oh my goodness. And I was so close to canceling, but at that point you just say, okay, let's figure this out. And so we started running around the church and looking for stuff. We found a drum set in the youth room, and just different things, and putting together other thing. And honestly, there were people coming in and being seated while we were setting up, and Dawn and the band showed up an hour after I did. The idea is for me to go in and do it. And those kinds of scenarios are just common when you go overseas, because there's language barriers, there's little things where people misunderstand something or whatever. So it's like, the idea is communicate as much as possible going into it, so you don't get surprised, but somehow or other you always still get surprised.
Yeah.
Churches in Africa that a lot of times they just don't have the gear, and you can say, this is all the stuff that we need to do what we do, and they just sort of ignore it and set up whatever they want to set up, and you end up doing some really strange things. So
There you go. Yeah,
yeah,
it sounds like, yeah, there is a book that you should write at some point about all of your your stories there. Oh my goodness.
yeah.
Um, so most, as we've been describing, kind of here, most would think of Chuck Harris as a studio engineer kind of thing.
Mhm.
Uh, but you've had a lot of experience doing in front of house mixing, that kind of thing. So
Yeah,
this may be a loaded question, but maybe let's figure out how you can parse this down. Chat through maybe what you perceive as differences, or at least something to point out of how you mentally approach a regular Sunday morning front of house mix
hmm
versus a a special event, say at your church or somewhere that you're capturing to Pro
right.
Tools or whatever, versus going and setting in a dedicated studio recording space. It's kind of three scenarios there. So maybe give my students some nuggets on you're still looking at a console, you're pushing faders, you're getting volume, but there's kind of a mental shift I would think that you go through to each one of those. So maybe kind of take this apart
Absolutely.
a little bit for us.
Absolutely. Okay. I think that the first thing to keep in mind is to begin with the end in mind. And so what you're really looking at is you're looking at a lot of similar tools at your disposal. Like you said, you're sitting in front of a console, you're doing things, and you're working with maybe even the same piece of music. You might be mixing it for a live audience. You might be mixing it for a record. It could be the same song, same arrangement, same musicians, everything, but your target is different. You in one spot, you're going to put something onto media, and people are going to get to play it back. And the thing that you can keep in mind is that people in that position can have control over the listening volume. So they're in their car, they can turn it up or turn it down as much as they want, but your audience is kind of stuck with what you give them.
Mm-hmm.
And so I think beginning with the end in mind, you think of your audience and the final destination. You also think of, at least for me, I think of the emotional impact that I'm trying to have uh, on something. So when I'm mixing for a record, for example, I have the opportunity to live inside of the song for a long time and pick apart different pieces
Mm.
and different layers and all of those things. And I'm kind of mixing for a three-dimensional experience, listening experience. Um, Whereas when you're mixing live, uh, you're still doing the same thing, but you're also, hopefully your mix position, you're sitting with the audience and you're listening as well. And while I'm still going for some of the 3D things, I'm also looking for a balance, um, to where there's an emotional impact to the music. And a lot of times that emotional impact comes from some of the low end, and then from some of the chordal uh, elements, like the pianos and the pads and the things, and some of the colorful elements, the guitars and the things that are going on there. And then ultimately, what's most important, especially I think in a worship service, is the vocal and
Mm.
how that is impacting people. You got a vocal performance and a worship leader who is the guy that's um, bringing the audience into a place of worship. And so it's really important that you're tracking with what he's doing. And in a live situation, there's more spontaneity, more more things to react to, and also an audience to consider.
Yeah.
Whereas you're
Mm.
mixing with a record, you realize, okay, I'm just trying to make this sonically as amazing as possible. And whereas live, I'm trying to make it more as emotionally amazing as possible. If
Yeah.
that
Yeah.
makes
Yeah. No, that's super. Um, yeah, I just remembered something that you had to go back and fix an audio thing back for an Israel Houghton theme because uh, I think we were trying to match the audio to some video that was shot, but then ultimately something got mixed differently or taken out of the audio, but it was now being shown on the video. So I think you were having to go back to the audio and bring that piece back sonically so that it actually, because now then it will match with the video. So that
Right.
was an intriguing scenario that I remember you going through.
Yeah, exactly. And that's a fairly common problem because you do when Integrity does a video product, it's really two products in one. You've got the audio product that you release as a CD or whatever, or streaming now, and
Mm-hmm.
and then you've got the video product. And so a lot of times you'll go into the studio after the live event, and because of sonic problems, performance issues, tuning issues, stuff like that, like sometimes it's very common now we tune vocals, and
Sure.
you go to tune a vocal from a live recording. The problem is you've got guitars and other tonal instruments leaking into the vocal mics. And when you go to tune the vocal, all of a sudden you get phasey stuff going on
Mm-hmm.
with the other stuff around it. And so you end up having to just replace the vocals. And so you're working with, and when you're mixing the record, a lot of times we would mix the record first because that's the first thing you release. You'll go through and um, it sound as great as you want, and then you go, and then you have to go back and put it to picture, and you realize, okay, when he did the overdubs, maybe he didn't match the picture as well as he should have, or there's spontaneous moments in the service where he's doing prompts,
Mm.
worship prompts, and those kinds of things, and you didn't necessarily use all of them in the audio product, but you need them in the video product because there he is with his mouth moving, that kind of stuff. So yeah, you got to go in and just finesse and tweak and look and stare and try to get the live audio to match the studio audio as much as possible. And then sometimes you just have to use a live phrase and replace the thing that you did.
Wow.
Just match. So yeah.
A lot of moving pieces there.
Yeah, the thing to do there is to pay attention. Like, for example, one thing you can do is if live the singer is using an SM58 on his vocal or a KSM 109 or whatever, use the same microphone that he used live and try to match the signal path and try to record it as close sonically as close as possible. The other beautiful thing about that is that, again, it's the other way around with instruments leaking into a lead vocal mic. When you're mixing a record, you want that vocal to be real present and real up front, but it's washed out because it's got drums pounding in the background. And when you bring up the vocal, all of a sudden the drums get real roomy and all of that stuff, and it kind of wrecks the sonics of your mix of what you're trying, because it's not a pretty leakage. It's usually not EQ'd optimally because you're using the lead vocal differently. So just stuff like that you have to, when you're doing a live video like that, you have to consider.
Yeah, well, that was something very small you said there that I just hadn't thought about, and maybe it's normal for full-time engineers, and that is if the singer was using that SM58, maybe, at least now I'm thinking about doing it, is in my Pro Tools session to make a note of what the mic was so that you're not having to try to go back and try to figure out or re-emulate it or something. So that's good, something for me to tuck away, is to actually put a note of what microphone was used.
Exactly. Well, and also in the studio, that's typical that you would document all of that stuff. You would either in your Pro Tools session or whatever, you got a place for notes, or in a notebook. A lot of times, and I'll do my whole signal path. Okay, lead vocal was, a Sony 800 into a GML preamp into a, whatever compressor or whatever EQ, and then document your settings even on there, because if you need to come back and do an overdub, you want to be able to land in the same place.
Yeah. Well, you've been you're talking about your experience back in California and what have you. You've been kind of the head of a audio video area within a church setting, but otherwise you've run audio in churches and what have you for some years. good or bad, in the middle of this COVID-19 moment right now, churches are waking up and going, oh, we actually have audio tech teams at our church and they're working hard and they're doing great. But before this and maybe after this, there are going to be those moments where things go wrong in a service. It's so easy and quick for people to kind of look back and go, oh, it's the sound guy's fault or whatever. So knowing that that can happen and you're full
Yeah.
of volunteers back there and all this kind of stuff, maybe some words of wisdom for these students who'll be graduating and going out who may be over a team like that, of maybe how to handle those situations, how to encourage their team, or how to receive that feedback from the congregation, or that kind of thing.
Boy, that's a big question. There's a lot
Yeah,
to that. Yeah. Wow. I think first off, my goal when I try to get through a church service is to have nobody realize I was there.
sure.
You know, when I was younger, the goal was to. I always wanted people to go, "Man, that sounded amazing." You know, that was what I really wanted. I wanted that kind of feedback, and sometimes it does, and sometimes it's great. But a lot of times, it's better if you can kind of be more transparent, stay out of the way, and let people experience church without it necessarily feeling like it's all being hyped and filtered and put
Mm,
through a bunch of stuff. Because, in my opinion, we get together for church to be a family and to worship
yeah,
the Lord together and all of that stuff. But beyond that, uh, well, you mentioned getting feedback, negative feedback sometimes from people, and that used to really crush me, and it's there's a number of reasons for it, that it's like the old wireless mic that starts cutting out in the middle of the service because the pastor's connection isn't right or something. And you know what? If that happens once, uh, then that's understandable. If it happens every Sunday, then you're not doing your own job. But
right,
that's
right.
besides. Um, but it's those moments where you find heads in the congregation looking back at you to fix whatever's, or some ringing feedback or whatever's going on in the service. And um, it's like, how do you deal with that? And my thing is that I'm there to be a servant. I'm there to serve the pastor. I'm there to serve the worship team. I'm there to serve the congregation. I'm like the least important guy in the equation. I'm really the most important guy in terms of my job and what I'm doing,
Sure.
but in terms of what's important of what's going on in the room, um, I don't need any credit or anything or affirmation or anything like that.
Well,
Um,
it's definitely generally a thankless job, unfortunately. But at
yeah,
the end of the day, I guess it's extremely important, though, because your job is to make sure that whatever that message is being proclaimed from that stage, it is coming back to that congregation as clear as possible. I mean, at the
yeah,
end of the day, that's the goal, be it
yeah,
in song or spoken or what have you.
yeah,
Um, that's heavy.
yeah.
Uh, Over the years, I know you've worked hard at staying on top of your craft
Mhm.
from kind of an educational standpoint of making sure you remain relevant and that kind of thing. So,
Yeah.
what are some ideas or thoughts of maybe how students can do that? Because I would think you would encourage that, of remaining current, relevant to their craft and technology.
Yeah. Yeah. Okay. Listen a lot. Be a listener of music when it comes to, especially that. I think, and I say that because I think music is the most challenging part of the service in terms of what we have to mix and all of that stuff. So, but I would say listen. So if your church is doing a lot of Bethel stuff or a lot of Hillsong stuff or whatever, listen to that music and listen with a critical ear. Sometimes you listen with headphones on, listen on good speakers, figure out what it is about the music and the way it's mixed and analyze. Just pick it apart and analyze. That's an exercise for me. For years and years and years ago, I just started listening to songs, and now I can't listen differently almost. So I'm almost moved more by the sonics of a piece of music than I am the lyrics. And that's just me. That's a personal thing. But as an engineer, so I would say listen is one main thing. Another thing is to avail yourself of resources. I mean, in this day and age, there are so many resources online. So different Facebook groups. I think I'm on a couple, church tech gurus or something like that. Behind the Mixer, Worship MD, Doug Gold. Doug?
Yep.
Yeah, just follow his Facebook page. There's a lot of educators out there and guys and engineers, other engineers that love to share their knowledge. You ask somebody, and I guarantee you ask an engineer a question, and he's going to love talking about it because most of his life he's not getting anybody talking to him because nobody cares. But when other younger engineers ask a specific question, you'll get answers, and I think that's a big thing. Just to avail yourself of those things that are available. Any courses? I'm part of on the recording side. I subscribe to Pure Mix, and they have great videos, teaching videos that are, they'll get Chris Lord Alge or F. Reed Shippen or all these great engineers, and they'll walk through how they mixed a song. They'll have their Pro Tools session on the screen, and they'll show you the plugins and all that, or they'll walk you through tracking a session, and and some of their videos are multi-part videos, and they'll walk you through the whole process from tracking to mixing to post-production and all of that stuff. So that's a great one. Puremix.net.
Nice.
So those kinds of things.
Yeah, I'll actually have to go check that out myself. I wasn't as familiar with that one.
Yeah.
We'll begin to wrap up our time here, but the program that we have at Cary focusing on worship technology is actually brand new. The students that are in it right now came in just this current trimester, matter of fact. So this coming fall will be the more the official true launch of this new program of preparing students for this space that's ever growing out in churches of technical directors and people in production and what have you. So being the one who's been a veteran at this for a few years, maybe as we kind of wind up things here, maybe some last minute, just kind of general wisdom, thoughts of encouragement from Chuck Harris to these students who are looking to do what you do one day.
Yeah, thank you. What you're doing and what you want to do is very important, and it blesses the church. It blesses God's kingdom, and I think that it is fraught with opportunity to learn, to grow, to be humbled, and to have very important relationships. So as you're working in a church situation, you're not just managing audio and sound, you're managing relationships with your senior pastor, relationship with your worship pastor, your worship leaders, the band, and even the congregation. And you have to keep different things in mind, like certain people in the congregation have hearing problems, so something might hurt their ears that doesn't hurt anybody's ears, and that kind of stuff. So it's always good to have some empathy in those things and ways to communicate through those things for those people and opportunities to work through those things. So it's all about building trust and all of that stuff. On the technology side, there are such great tools, and don't be afraid to just stay on top of what other people are doing and asking questions on these different forums and YouTube channels and that kind of stuff. And, just understand that what the congregation hears is what's being presented from the front of the stage, but it's all going through you. And you have an important responsibility and opportunity to serve both what's going on the platform and what's going on in the congregation. So take it seriously. Don't let yourself get territorial or rude or defensive or any of that stuff. Be humble and loving and do your job with excellence.
Wow, I don't know if I could wrap it up any better than that right there. So students, I really hope that you take the time to dissect and really take apart some great words here from Chuck, and his encouragement to you in these years to come as you're stepping out there and you graduate and begin to find yourself the local church or wherever God takes you in this training that you've gotten in technology. Because as Chuck's experienced, there's a lot of opportunities that can come about that. So Chuck, thank you, and it was great to reconnect with you today, and for me to be able to step outside and enjoy some a beautiful day here. So yeah, well, Chuck, thank you. God bless you, and I'll be in touch with you again soon, I'm sure. All right, thanks all.
God bless you.